Welcome to A Time to Think. Chris, we started this podcast a number of months ago, still kind of in our infancy, right?
Yeah,
We're,
toddlerhood
we're
actually. I
still
think we're
getting our sleep
toddlerhood.
schedules down,
Yep.
learning to walk, still a little wobbly on our feet
Yep.
sometimes.
Falling down sometimes, but we're doing it.
But we had a conviction a few months ago that there were many things that were worthy of Christian consideration that we just didn't have time to do from the
Hmm.
pulpit.
Right.
We get to the scriptures on Sunday, and honestly, on Sundays, our job is to look at the scriptures and say, what does God have for us and our people? Um, Sundays aren't for our projects.
Correct.
I mean,
Correct.
how often do you and I have to fight against things we feel like we want to say,
Sure.
but God's not actually calling us to say those
Exactly.
things? Um, and so we created another space where things that were on our mind, and not just because we wanted to run our mouths, but because we thought they were important for the Christian life,
Yeah.
um, that we would have a time to think about those things. But even a deeper reason, Chris, that we saw a need for people to spend time thinking, because it's not really
Hmm.
something that most people in our culture do.
Right.
Is we spend time reacting, we spend time with our emotional
Hmm.
engagement, we spend time yelling and disagreeing, but not a lot of time thinking.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're doing here on A Time to Think is one, what are the things that we as pastors find important for the Christian life? But two, how do we need to consider those, think about those
Hmm.
in a way that our culture is not really teaching us or our people to do so? And we started off with a long series on sexuality because it's in our face all the time.
Hmm.
And as we discussed what's next, we started discussing media consumption. And so the next 8 episodes that we're going to do have to do with media consumption, the modern media landscape, and what that's doing to us, and then how the Christian should respond. But I think we should start a little bit with the irony of the fact that we're going to do a podcast on media consumption.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's the difference in what we're doing here? Are all podcasts but ours bad, Chris?
I don't think that's probably a helpful way to look at it. The reality is that we're always existing within the culture, and so even Athanasius, when he is about 1,700 years ago, he's what we call a church father of sorts, really significant character in the
Hmm.
history of the church. He made a statement that in Latin is contra mundum, which is against the
Hmm.
world. And so Athanasius basically said, well, if the world's against me, I'm against the world, and that's fine. For Jesus' sake, that's fine. And at the same time, he's still functioning within a context where he is trying to influence the world around him.
Hmm.
So, for us to come at issues of media consumption, we're not saying outright that it's wrong to consume media. We're not Amish, right? So we're not advocating for the disruption of somebody's entire lifestyle simply because there are some things that are bad about
Hmm.
it. But we want to see how can we be redemptive
Right.
in our approach towards, really this is probably the most significant aspect of our culture that sets it apart from any other era of
Right.
history, is that media is now the primary means by which ideas are communicated and people communicate themselves
Yeah.
to others.
How do we? Redemptive is a great word.
Hmm.
Ephesians 5 says, "Redeem the time."
Yeah.
Essentially, make the best use of the time, which can be translated "redeem the time."
Hmm.
And there's a purposefulness there, Chris. Like
Hmm.
the phrase that keeps coming to my mind is, "How do we use media rather than be used by it?"
Correct.
Because we can all understand the feeling of having been used by media. It leaves us like a bad relationship, like tired and wearied and anxious
Yeah.
and spent, and then we go back to it the next
Hmm.
day. And but when used properly, can be very life
Yeah.
giving, can be just an incredible resource. So some of the ideas we're discussing come from a book written in the 1980s, which it's always fascinating when you read a book from the 50s or the 70s or the 80s that was about media consumption.
Hmm.
And it seems true now, and you realize they were talking about just like the advent of 30-minute news
Right.
shows.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh my gosh, this guy did not know exactly how bad it was
Hmm.
going to get. And Neil Postman writes, it's called "Amusing Ourselves to Death." And I think his thesis is that the change from writing-based, print-based news to television-based culture has just been a massive shift.
Yeah.
And we'll add computers and social media and stuff like
Hmm.
that, because computers really just facilitate visual things
Right.
like a television does.
Right.
And so he's just showing, hey, what is true because of this shift from a writing-based culture to a television-based culture. And so we're going to spend about 4 episodes talking about that shift,
Hmm.
and then spend 4 episodes talking about just the nature of what that shift has done to the Christian. How do we use our time better? How do we approach media?
Yeah.
So, Chris, the first topic, and the first 4 are kind of they're they're couched in like a boxing match. You
Yeah.
have one thing versus another
Yep.
thing, and the first is trivial versus significant,
Hmm.
insignificant versus significant. And so, what Postman spends a lot of time talking about is that modern media, because it's image based, it just kind of teaches us to focus on things that are fleeting, focus on things that we don't really have to ponder,
Hmm.
focus on things that are trivial. Whereas older cultures that trafficked in like uh, oral dissemination of poetry
Hmm.
or narratives that were about the origin of man or the stories of the culture, like they were
Hmm.
the ways you spent your time was sharing the significant.
Hmm.
But now we spend our time sharing, and I mean, what's the last video you sent a friend? If you can,
I don't know,
I
because
think
I've
you,
actually tried to pull away
yeah,
from
okay,
YouTube on my telephone. My telephone.
yeah,
I've tried to pull away from that, so I typically will use it in a group setting.
okay,
So there's a way I'm actually trying to peel back
yeah,
personally.
man,
But
yeah. I think the last
no,
one
no,
I sent,
Conan O'Brien. There we go. Conan O'Brien. We watched it. We went fishing on Saturday. Some
okay,
guys from church went
did you catch
fishing.
anything?
I did actually,
A
and
cold?
no, I caught a salmon, a lovely salmon that
Did
was
you go
not completely
to Did
dead.
you go to the
Went to
eastern part of the
Manitowoc.
state? Good
Went
for
to
you.
Manitowoc. Yeah, it was a good time. And so we had
Yeah.
meaningful time there. But on the way back, we watched a clip from a Conan O'Brien episode where he was interacting with his producer
Yeah.
Jordan Schlansky. Fun stuff.
Typical
But,
Conan, like funny.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
just
But nothing life changing.
no, and it's the same for me. I think one of the last videos I shared was a, a, a funny commentary on the differences between dating and marriage. Stuff like, honey, I'm going out to the store. What would you love? I'd love to love you. Versus coming back from the store and going, oh, my bad.
That's what you wanted.
And so,
Yeah.
I mean, there's some things you can learn from it, but it's really not like it's not a significant discussion of marriage. It's
Right.
and what that shows, Chris, is that a lot of the things we share with one another are not they're quick, they're funny,
Hmm.
they're trivial is the
Sure.
word that Postman is using. Can you reflect a little bit on just maybe what you see as far as triviality or insignificance in the media landscape around us?
Yeah, absolutely. And people who know me, for just me personally, know that I love laughing. I love enjoying comedy. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's it's a part of me just as a person. I like being funny. I like being amused by
Mm-hmm.
comedy. That's part of who I am. And so, I think as we reflect on this, to try to draw the distinction between, again, we don't want to cultivate the idea that triviality is funness.
Can we define triviality? Just
Yeah.
because I think before you make that distinction, when I'm thinking trivial, I'm thinking something that's fleeting. It's just
Hmm.
kind of passing.
Sure.
It's not life altering, so
Yeah.
it doesn't lead Chris to change anything about himself
Right.
or to think about anything differently. It's not long lasting, so kind of that
Mhm.
fleeting nature. It's a flash in the pan. Well, I'm not going to revisit it probably 10 years from now.
Right.
And then maybe it's a distraction.
Yeah.
It's really not meant for any type of serious engagement.
Mhm.
It's mostly just I'm in the doctor's office
Sure.
waiting, and
Read a
instead of
magazine.
yeah, but now instead of a magazine, it's Twitter,
Look at your phone.
right?
Yeah.
So when we think trivial, we're thinking not long lasting, fleeting, not life altering, things that are
Yeah.
pretty distracting. Now you're making a distinction that that's not always bad.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we talked in preparation for this episode, I think you used a really helpful analogy talking about we're saying media diet, media consumption, and the idea of a dessert. It's
Hmm.
not wrong to have a dessert. I mean, we actually on our way back from Manitowoc, we had we had talked about the Olive Garden and how
Yeah.
the best thing about the Olive Garden is that you get Andes mints at
Oh
the
yeah.
end of the meal, right? So they toss a bunch of Andes mints on the table, and you're like, well, this was so nice. This was so
And
kind.
you're like waiting to see if there's a hostess at the hostess table.
Who's going to give you more of them? Right?
There's
Exactly.
there's not. You
you
can.
can grab a few more on the way out. And so there's nothing wrong with having your Andes mints after
Mhm.
you go to the Olive Garden. It's just fun. It's a little topper, and yet if somebody's going to the Olive Garden saying, I'm gonna forego my soup, salad, and breadsticks, and I'm just gonna ask them bring me a pile of Andes mints,
Unlimited Andes mints,
unlimited Andes mints.
please.
You know, you're gonna have some issues at
Mhm.
some point, right? And so when we think about triviality versus significance in our culture, I think it's really the distinction between um, what we're consuming that's filling us up, right? So is is what is filling our heads, filling our hearts, filling our souls, is that something as we evaluate the fleeting nature of it versus the lasting nature, the sustaining nature of it versus the, cotton candy, good for a
Mhm.
few minutes, Andes mints for good for minutes, but you're not really getting nourished by it. And so there's, something that I found interesting. I will commonly, if I'll go to the Fox News website,
Mhm.
check on what's going on in the news, and there will be significant moments highlighted in the news that people should be,
Right.
apprised of, that okay, the queen has passed away, right? So there are moments that you should be aware this has happened. And yet there are other things that show up on these news feeds because they need to fill
Right.
space. And this is part of how advertising works. This is just how people want to entertain, and we'll talk about that later, is the entertainment nature of
The Queen has passed away. Also, see Prince Harry's disagreements with the Queen.
Oh yeah, exactly. And even what's worse than that, and my kids will even make fun of this at times. It'll be like, what's happened with the Kardashians lately? And I think that's kind of probably the most, if we want to put a caricature up of how our culture has gone in this direction,
Mhm.
triviality, we
Yeah.
think Kardashians, right? Well, nobody knows who they are except they're the Kardashians.
Right.
What does that matter? It's just, well, they're the Kardashians. And so there's a triviality about, and it's not like they're insignificant as human beings, but the insignificance of their actions, like who really cares?
Mhm.
And so when I'll go to the Fox News website, I'll of course scroll down to look at the comments that people will make on these articles. And time and again on these articles that have a real trivial nature
Mhm.
to them, it'll be like celebrity so and so, whatever, and you'll scroll down and somebody will say something that I just, it's become commonplace, and I think it's hilarious. They'll say, this morning I had toast and eggs for breakfast, because they're just highlighting the fact that this should matter to me,
Yeah.
because so I'm just going to tell you something insignificant about
Mhm.
my life. We should write a news story about it. And so I think that's really indicative of the fact that as a culture we're trying to fill space,
Yeah.
and even if it's insignificant, we don't care as long as it's something we're just consuming,
Yeah.
shoving down our mouths.
Yeah. Which, once again, why the diet analogy is helpful is, um, we can eat constantly,
Hmm.
and if you're eating constantly and you're in a culture where you're sitting a ton, you're not really concerned with what fills you,
Hmm.
and you're also not really concerned with what you need that food to do.
Right.
So if you're working on a farm, then one, you just don't have as much time to eat
Hmm.
because you're not sitting, you're not around a refrigerator.
Right.
And then when you do eat, you need something that will actually give you the energy to go do the thing you're
Hmm.
trying to do. And I think the same, but if we have snacks. One of the changes we made as a church in the past 3 months is we now have snacks just available all the time. And I'm like, I eat more now. It's because I come into the office, I could have that, and
They
I
are
could have
healthy
that.
snacks,
Yeah, they're not
albeit, but
terrible, but
yeah,
but I just I keep consuming,
sure.
and the same is true with having a phone at our disposal.
Yep.
We don't have to wait for the newspaper to come in the morning.
Hmm.
That triviality is constantly available, and we work on computers, so it's constantly a click
Hmm.
away. Or I work on my phone a lot; it's constantly a click away, and I found that to be true this weekend. I left my Bible. I was in Milwaukee, just about 3 hours away from where we are, and I left my Bible here in Wausau. So when I opened up my Bible app to read a
Hmm.
little scripture in the morning when I woke up, I constantly was going to other apps
Sure.
in a way that I'm not tempted to
Yep.
when I have just a physical Bible. I can't go to my physical Bible and then click Twitter on it. It's just not an option.
Hmm.
And so the triviality is just constantly available. It's constantly new. I think
Yeah.
that's one of the tantalizing things. Um, Before we move on to I guess further discussion of this, Chris, I guess why why do you think we want to fill so much of our time with things that are fleeting?
Mhm.
They're not life. Like what is up with the Kardashians or Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston's
Well,
marriage,
you're dating
or
yourself, man.
Aaron Rodgers' drug of choice,
Right.
or Like, they're not life altering, they're
Right.
fleeting, and yet we want more.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, I think there are really, I mean, a couple of reasons that make sense. I mean, if we look at the biblical worldview, the biblical perspective on the human experience, there are injunctions given against behaviors that I think are illustrated by this um, insignificant communication. There's the injunction against gossip,
Hmm.
right? Gossip is typically speaking insignificant in the content.
Yeah.
It's
Did
not
you hear what
gossip.
so and so did?
Exactly. You know, if you're saying, hey, somebody committed murder, that's not gossip. That's news,
Yeah.
right? So that's there is something of substance that's being communicated there because murder is a big deal. But if you're saying
You would want to know that
exactly,
someone you know takes life of other people. Like,
exactly,
that's news, it's relevant.
exactly, and yet when the biblical injunction against gossip comes, I think it's because in our hearts, there is something bound up in our sinfulness. And I don't want to pretend to even understand how this operates, but there's something bound up in our sinfulness that says we actually get a certain rush
Hmm.
from focusing on these very trivial matters, particularly, I would say, if we're going to, kind of drill down a little more, particularly when it comes to the reflection that it has on others. And so to drive that a little bit more, gossip or triviality typically revolves around something that will make us feel better about
Hmm.
ourselves. So matters of significance have the opportunity, at least, to make us question and challenge our worldviews,
Right.
or question and challenge what we're doing.
Yeah.
Trivial matters don't do that, and so they're safe.
That's
And
good.
so we can look at other people and say, oh, look how bad that person is. I don't need to be challenged in my ethics, my morality, my behavior. Furthermore, it's just kind of fun to talk
Yeah.
about stupid things about others because, well, why not? And God says, this is not good. This is not part of what your substance as a human being should be comprised
So
of.
there's two pieces there. One is a self-righteousness piece
Yeah.
that is inherently it's sinful.
Yep.
I may not enjoy seeing news about the Kardashians or celebrities because I like them or like what they're
Right.
doing, but I might gather some form of enjoyment seeing the implosion of Kanye
Yes.
West
Oh,
and Kim
exactly.
Kardashian's marriage. Like,
Exactly.
there's something sinful in me that goes, ha.
Yep.
Um, um, so there's that, and then I think that the safety piece, because sometimes I think it's pretty clear when we're acting sinfully in that way, and
Hmm.
but the safety piece is super interesting, Chris. Like, if we're tired, and I think most of us are tired, and this is something we're going to get to in terms of media, is that it's actually probably causing more weariness than
Sure.
good. Um, we're tired, we're constantly stimulated, we're like constantly bombarded by things that people are telling us are breaking or they're life changing, which
Hmm.
is one of the interesting things about modern news is everything is breaking, but it's also trivial.
Right.
Like, um, breaking news, something that doesn't actually matter to you.
Yeah, 20 years ago on Fox News, if I saw breaking news, it was the World Trade Center
Yeah,
coming down. Now it's stock market went down 30 points.
right. Um, so that's an interesting thing is like have anxiety because this is breaking, but it's not actually going to change
Right.
your life, and so that's constantly happening. I think you're spot on, Chris, when you're saying something something like sports, it's safe.
Hmm.
Uh, something you can argue the validity of this, but I think a lot of people strayed from sports for a year or two because politics was being brought into the messaging
Hmm.
of sports, and like, geez, can I have one place?
Right.
um, and so I think you're spot on with the safety component. We don't want to be challenged. Now, this is where we just have to have a little bit of a nuance in our conversation. I totally agree that we need places in our lives where we're not challenged.
Right.
I mean, you and I have a mentally and spiritually engaging and sometimes exhausting job,
Yeah.
um, and we need moments in our day where we're not thinking.
Hmm.
And so, as much as we're calling people to take a time to think,
Yeah.
you and I might be on the other end of the spectrum where we're like,
We
can
need
we
time not to
can we
think.
plan sometimes not to? Yeah.
Right.
And I think the same is true with someone who works a 9 to 5 and has a couple kids
Hmm.
and just says, man, can I have some moments where I'm not thinking about my failures, or I'm not thinking about my
Hmm.
inadequacies, or I'm not comparing myself to others,
Right.
and but the problem is when we start to fill all of our time with that because it is easier, it is safer, and so I think what we're trying to unearth here is like there's so much triviality available, just like there's so much dessert available,
Mm-hmm.
that we can fill all of our time with it, just like we can fill all of our plate with it. And particularly as Christians, we have to pull back and say, I need to actually look at my week and say, how much time should be spent on the insignificant
Mm-hmm.
and how much time should be spent on the significant? Because if I don't, I'm going to get used by the insignificant.
Sure.
It's just going to bombard me. It's always going to be there. I have this image in my head, Chris, of like, you and I have different vices. You're never going to pick up a beer, but I don't like ice cream as much as you do.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking about like, what would Chris have food-wise, like that would maybe be like having an iPhone. And I was like, what if Chris always had a fresh ice cream cone in his pocket?
Yeah.
Like it wasn't melting,
That's
that'd
messy,
be gross.
right?
But like you could always reach in your pocket and pull out the perfect ice cream cone.
Yeah.
Always. You could do it 15 times a day. I was like, you know how unhealthy? Like, if I had a Dr. Pepper in my pocket all the time, like just fresh, unopened, you get
Sure.
like
Sure.
just perfect. I would be so unhealthy.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what we have in regards to the triviality and the insignificance of media. It's
Absolutely.
just there all the
Mhm.
time. It's a reach away.
Doesn't melt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doesn't melt. So what we want to do is say you have to think not only about what you're thinking about, but how much time you're spending thinking
Mhm.
about what you're thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
Say it again. You have to think about not only what you're thinking about, but how much time you're spending. Looking at my week, are all of my car rides just the time is filled with audio of the insignificant? And where this really takes some heart understanding is you can use significant things insignificantly.
Mm-hmm.
So like you could listen to a really good audiobook, but if you're only listening to it for the purpose of distracting yourself
Sure.
on car rides, it's actually insignificant.
Yeah.
You're not listening to it for the purpose of learning. You're not listening to it for the purpose of sharing it with others. You're just like, I need some noise.
Mm-hmm.
So even important things can be used trivially.
Yeah.
And so we have to step back, and that's actually been a major shift in my life recently is when I have the impulse to play a song in my house or play a podcast in my car, just asking why.
Mm-hmm.
Is it because I've had a hard day and I just don't want to think about it? Like,
Sure.
well, maybe I should actually give myself 15 minutes of quiet
Mm.
before I go home. How would you see that reflected in your life, Chris, as you think about balancing the trivial and the significant?
Yeah. There's been a pendulum that's swung for me over the years. For a long time, when I was in seminary, I spent all my time thinking about the significant, right? And so during that time period, I was very much against using time trivially, right? So I'll be able to speak from probably both ends of the
Sure.
spectrum because you can burn yourself out doing that. You can burn yourself out because God didn't design you simply to think about significant things all the time, right? So,
By significant, we'll talk about this just in a moment. We're talking
Yeah.
about like heaven, hell, sin,
Right.
death, God, salvation,
Yes.
eternity, like
yes,
massive, weighty, true, real things.
Yep.
And you're saying God has not designed you to be pondering that
yeah.
all the time.
And I would say, there's even an interesting caveat that I'll put on that because when I was in seminary, media existed, right? So
Mhm.
you can be inundated with significant things because of the medium that we consume. So you can even do like you had talked about significant things using them insignificantly. But if you use significant things significantly using an insignificant medium, you can become so deluged with information and so deluged with things that you feel like, well, this is very important, and it just completely overwhelms you. The distinction is made between watching and reading.
Mhm.
That is something that Postman talks about, where he says the difference between sitting down, reading a book, and kind of functioning that way versus watching in the iconographic form. The distinction here is that if you are listening all the time, just listening intently, if you are then reading, or if you are watching a documentary, if all these things are just kind of all the time coming at you, I would say that's even unnatural. That's an
Everything's
unnatural.
significant, everything's urgent, but
Yes.
nothing actually is, because nothing is. It's almost as fleeting as the trivial thing, because you're just going to listen to a new thing next
Sure.
anyways.
Sure.
So that obscenely important thing that you just listened to, actually you're going to forget because you're listening to a new thing.
Right. And this is how, when it comes to the issue of preaching, for us each week when we preach, we're not saying sit down for 8 hours while we preach through 5 heavy topics back to back to
Mhm.
back to back to back. We don't ask people to do that because it's unnatural.
Mhm.
It's an unnatural thing to do that. Now, there are some times, I mean, we did a few years ago, participated in the David Platt
Mhm.
Secret Church.
Mhm.
And so that's a very intense multi-hour period. I'll tell you, it was overwhelming to me.
It's hard.
Yeah, and I spent years in seminary thinking about this stuff all the time. It's overwhelming, I think, in part because even though it might be like a very special event, a special opportunity to do, we're not wired for that.
Mhm.
So we're wired to be able to think about significant things for a particular period of time. And then we can take that and we can internalize it,
Yeah.
contextualize it, and live it out and deal with it. And I think my concern, when we kind of discuss this trivial versus significant and how much time we're spending on it, that kind of a thing, is also to recognize that we're dealing with a volume issue as well.
Hmm.
It's not just the quality of the content, but it's the volume of that content. And the fact that you can go online now, you can take
Yeah.
the same types of seminary courses that you are taking that I took, and just like play,
Yeah.
hit play over and over again, and be like, oh, and then not have anything to do with it,
Right.
right? So in either situation, we've just become so inundated with either significant or trivial matters that everything does become significant,
Yeah.
right? So on Fox News' website, Kim Kardashian, dot, dot, dot. Well, this is significant, breaking news. But it's also a trivial thing.
Mhm.
So everything's been amplified. Everything has been put up for us as a matter of significance, not simply because of the quality of the content, but because everything should be. Everything
Mhm.
should grab our attention. And it really, I think, starts to wreck us internally because we don't know how to distinguish anymore. So
Yeah.
that even if we need to recreate, we don't know how recreation should function.
Yeah, and the volume piece is huge, Chris. You think of it in terms of alcohol. Most people are very comfortable with either not drinking a lick, no drop of
Sure.
alcohol. Just it's dangerous. It's just not worth it. Great,
Mhm.
I don't like it anyways. Don't drink a drop. Or, come on, like, stop being legalistic. I
Right.
can have whatever I want. That
Yep.
I don't need to really monitor. The hardest thing to do is to have one drink.
Sure.
Just like many people can lose a lot of weight on incredibly strict diets for a
Mhm.
period of time, because it's easiest to either have everything you want or have an amazingly strict set of guidelines of what you cannot have.
Yep.
It's harder to have 2 desserts a week.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier to have 0 or 14. It's harder to have 2. And so the volume issue, this is everywhere in the Christian life. It's
Mhm.
it's self-control.
Yeah.
And so, one thing that my wife and I try to monitor is, um, yeah, I mean, she's at home with the kids. She's also in school. So she's both thinking and emotionally exhausted by the end of the day. I'm in school and pastoring a church. And so when we put Thomas down at 7:15, usually the first thing we do is go and watch television while we
Mhm.
eat dinner. What we've tried to do recently, though, is stop at like 8.
Hmm.
So let's go watch one show.
Hmm.
Sitcoms, 20 minutes, maybe we get 2.
I have a real
But
hard
like,
time doing that.
but
Really
then
hard time.
from 8 to 9, let's go brush our teeth. Let's sit in bed. Let's read. Let's read for 20 minutes. Let's fall asleep, not exhaustedly, but naturally.
Hmm.
It's so much harder to do that.
Yeah.
Because once you start, it's like, well, and I think that's where the volume piece is huge, is
Yeah.
because we don't want anyone to leave this episode and be like, are you kidding me? Those fundamentalists only watch television. No, what we want you to do is to be purposeful about how you watch television, or to be purposeful about how many articles you read. And
I love how Netflix, even now, they have a little prompt that'll pop up saying, "Are you still watching this?"
Yeah.
It's just really funny because they even recognize people can really
Yeah.
go nuts with this stuff. And so a company that benefits from you binging,
Hmm.
and going to dietary analogy,
Yeah.
you're binging content, even they recognize maybe it's not healthy that you
Yeah.
do this for 4 hours straight.
And so maybe to sum everything up here, Chris, one of the grand distinctions for the Christian to be thinking about is you need to spend a healthy period of time thinking about things that are worth thinking about.
Hmm.
So if you're the type of person who only thinks about trivial things, I don't want to think about God, I don't want to think about my sin, I don't want to think about my failure, I don't want to
Hmm.
think about eternity, I don't want to think about heaven or hell. I just want to get through my week. Then Christian, you need to spend some time pondering the nature of God.
Hmm.
You need to spend time thinking about how he's different than you.
And let me
You-
just put a little plug in here, Josh.
yes.
This is one reason why, and in future podcasts, we've talked about devoting significant amount of time to the significance of the church.
Hmm.
But I mean, this is why you put this in context and why we just plead with Christians in our church who are part of our church and those who are not yet part of our church to say, can you not, you think Jesus, could you not just stay awake with me for 1 hour as he's
Hmm.
talking to the disciples? Could you not, in the context of a life in which you are constantly binging material, could you not take an hour and a half
Hmm.
once a week to set your mind on things above?
Hear
Could
the
you not do
scriptures
that?
which are significant,
Exactly.
the songs, the singing of the significant, the sermon.
Yeah, could you not calibrate your
Right.
soul just once a week?
Or even if you're here once a week to reframe, like, oh my goodness, this is someone is cultivating a time for my eyes to be lifted.
Yep.
Like, what a gift.
Yep.
And so if you're on the trivial end, brother, sister, you got to spend time not only in the Sunday service but with other believers thinking about weighty matters and
Mhm.
how and life-altering matters like the redemption of your souls
Yeah.
and the grace and mercy of a holy God towards
Mhm.
sinners, making them saints.
Yep.
If you're like me or Chris back in seminary and you're just constantly consuming even important content, but you're never stopping,
Mhm.
then brother, sister, you need to stop and ponder some
Right.
of that. And maybe take in a third of what you're taking in so that you can spend the rest of the time thinking about it.
Mhm.
Because it doesn't become significant unless you ponder it
Right.
and chew on it
Yeah.
and allow it to change you.
Yeah.
And so I think the call to the Christian is to identify what pole you are on
Mhm.
and to make an adjustment
Mhm.
towards spending a healthy period of time on triviality and a healthy period of time on the significant.
Absolutely.
So thanks for taking some time to think on this hopefully not that trivial podcast.